Mark Carney spoke moments ago announcing that Canada will slap 25% tariffs on U.S. vehicles that are not compliant with the free trade agreement.
What if a single political promise in Washington could quietly destabilize an entire North American industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars, raise car prices for American families, and put millions of jobs at risk across the United States and Canada at the same time? That is the unsettling question now hanging over North America as the trade war with Canada escalates beyond rhetoric and into structural risk. President Trump and his administration are openly signaling that automobile assembly must return to American soil, even if that means permanent tariffs on steel, aluminum, and vehicles crossing the northern border. The political message is simple. The economic consequences are not. For more than half a century, the United States and Canada have built a single, deeply integrated automotive supply chain that cannot be unwound quickly, cheaply, or cleanly. Attempting to force it apart could raise vehicle prices, disrupt manufacturing, and accelerate job losses on both sides of the border. And before this analysis concludes, one critical reality often ignored in Washington may reveal why this strategy is far more dangerous than it appears. Behind the political soundbites, the economic exposure is already measurable, and it is far larger than many Americans realize. The automotive industry in the United States supports nearly 10 million jobs when manufacturing, parts suppliers, logistics, dealerships, and related services are counted together. Each year, Americans buy roughly 16 million vehicles, most of which rely on components that cross the border with Canada multiple times before final assembly. Canada supplies the United States with more aluminum than any other country, accounting for roughly half of all American aluminum imports, a critical input for modern vehicle production. Steel from Canada is also priced below many domestic alternatives, helping keep costs competitive. Since new tariffs were imposed, industry analysts estimate that vehicle production costs in North America have already increased by several $1,000s per unit, even before any full relocation of supply chains begins. At the same time, investment decisions are freezing, auto manufacturers are delaying plant expansions, parts suppliers are cutting shifts, and consumer prices are quietly rising. This is no longer theoretical. The trade war is moving from negotiation rooms into factory floors and household budgets. And yet, one number buried in recent industry forecasts suggests this disruption may only be the opening phase of a much deeper shock still ahead. While the political focus remains fixed on factories and flags, the first real damage from this phase of the trade war is already landing much closer to home. Inside the United States, the automotive sector is not a narrow manufacturing niche. It is a vast employment ecosystem that supports nearly 10 million American jobs across assembly plants, steel production, aluminum processing, parts manufacturing, logistics networks, dealerships, and maintenance services. When tariffs hit one segment of that chain, the shock does not stop at the factory gate. Since steel and aluminum tariffs were reimposed and expanded, automakers have faced immediate cost increases on essential inputs. Industry data from North American auto manufacturers indicates that material costs for a single vehicle have risen by several $1,000s compared to pre-tariff conditions. These costs do not disappear. They are passed along through the supply chain and eventually land in showroom prices. For American consumers, this is unfolding at the worst possible moment. Vehicle affordability was already under pressure due to elevated interest rates and tighter credit conditions. Now, higher production costs are pushing sticker prices even further out of reach. Analysts tracking consumer auto loans report that monthly payment levels are rising even as sales volumes soften. This combination is historically associated with declining demand, which in turn places pressure on employment throughout the sector. Workers feel this pressure first through reduced overtime, temporary shutdowns, and delayed hiring. Parts suppliers, many of which operate on thin margins, are particularly vulnerable. Several major suppliers have already warned investors that continued tariffs could force production cuts or relocation decisions that affect American jobs directly. This is the contradiction at the heart of the policy. A strategy designed to protect American manufacturing risks, destabilizing the very workforce it claims to defend. And yet, this is only the domestic side of the equation. The deeper damage becomes visible when the full cross-border system is examined. Canada's automotive sector may appear smaller on paper, producing roughly 1 million vehicles per year compared to the vastly larger American market, but size is misleading. Canadian factories are deeply embedded in American production lines, supplying engines, transmissions, aluminum components, and advanced manufacturing inputs that American plants depend on every day. More than 80% of Canadian vehicle production is exported to the United States. At the same time, Canadian producers import American components in return. This circular flow means that tariffs imposed at the border do not isolate damage to one country. They amplify it on both sides. When Canadian plants reduce output due to rising costs or uncertainty, American factories feel the shortage almost immediately. The aluminum market provides a clear example. Canada is the single largest supplier of primary aluminum to the United States, accounting for nearly half of total imports. This aluminum is critical for modern vehicles, which increasingly rely on lightweight materials to meet efficiency and safety standards. Replacing this supply domestically is not a short-term option. Building new smelting capacity requires massive capital investment, long regulatory timelines, and reliable access to low-cost energy, something many American regions currently lack. As costs rise and supply tightens, American manufacturers face a choice between absorbing losses or reducing output. Neither outcome supports long-term industrial strength. Meanwhile, Canadian unemployment has already climbed above 7%, driven in part by manufacturing slowdowns linked to trade uncertainty. As Canadian demand weakens, American exporters lose a key market, further compounding the economic drag. This feedback loop is what makes the current phase of the trade war especially dangerous. It is no longer about leverage in negotiations. It is about a system that, once destabilized, becomes difficult to control. And buried within upcoming investment forecasts is one overlooked figure that suggests the next stage of disruption could be far more severe than policymakers are admitting publicly. From the perspective of Washington, the logic behind this phase of the trade war appears straightforward. President Trump believes tariffs give the United States leverage, discipline trading partners, and force manufacturing investment back onto American soil. In the case of automaking, the objective is clear and explicit. Reduce dependence on Canada, concentrate production inside the United States, and make domestic industry less vulnerable to external pressure. However, the data tell a far more complicated story. The United States automotive sector does not operate in isolation. It is the endpoint of a continental production system that has been optimized over decades. According to industry data compiled before the current tariff escalation, roughly 1/3 of the value of vehicles assembled in the United States comes from imported components, with Canada representing the single most important partner. These components are not interchangeable commodities. They are specialized parts, certified to exact specifications, produced in facilities that cannot be replicated quickly. Forcing this system to compress back into one country introduces structural inefficiencies. Capital investment required to rebuild equivalent capacity inside the United States is measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Construction timelines for new plants typically span many years, even before accounting for regulatory approvals, skilled labor shortages, and energy constraints. During that transition, production losses are unavoidable. Financial markets have begun to price in these risks. Several major automakers have warned investors that prolonged tariffs will reduce margins and delay long-term investment plans. These warnings matter because the automotive industry is one of the largest sources of capital spending in the United States economy. When automakers pause or scale back, the ripple effects extend into construction, technology, transportation, and regional employment. There is also a political risk that is rarely discussed openly. Rising vehicle prices act as a regressive cost on households, disproportionately affecting middle-income and older Americans who rely on personal vehicles for work and daily life. As prices rise and financing becomes more difficult, dissatisfaction does not remain confined to boardrooms. It moves into voter sentiment. That feedback loop may explain why some officials are already signaling that relief talks could emerge later, even as public rhetoric remains aggressive. Yet Washington is not operating in a vacuum. The international response is beginning to reshape the battlefield. Outside the United States, allies and competitors alike are watching this trade war with growing concern. Canada, facing direct pressure on its manufacturing base, is already accelerating diversification efforts. Trade flows toward Europe and the Asia-Pacific region are increasing, particularly in energy, critical minerals, and advanced materials. Once supply chains shift, history shows they rarely return to previous patterns. For the United States, this creates a strategic paradox. Tariffs are intended to strengthen domestic industry, but they also encourage partners to reduce reliance on the American market. Over time, this weakens United States' influence over standards, pricing, and technological direction. In the automotive sector, where electric vehicles, battery supply chains, and advanced materials are becoming central, losing that influence carries long-term consequences. International investors are also recalibrating risk. North America has long been viewed as a stable, integrated manufacturing zone anchored by predictable trade rules. Persistent uncertainty around tariffs and the future of continental agreements changes that perception. Capital is mobile. If investors conclude that North American production carries political risk premiums, investment may shift elsewhere, not back into the United States as intended. Perhaps the most underappreciated consequence is how this trade war interacts with global competition. While the United States and Canada absorb costs fighting each other manufacturing regions gain relative advantage. Lower-cost producers with stable trade environments become more attractive. Over time, this dynamic can erode the global competitiveness of American automakers, even if production technically remains onshore. This is the deeper contradiction now emerging. A strategy designed to make the United States more self-sufficient may, under pressure from global markets and investor behavior, achieve the opposite outcome. And according to long-range industry projections, one specific investment trend suggests that the most disruptive phase of this trade war has not yet begun. In the short term, the political optics in the United States appear deceptively favorable. Announcements of new factory investments, pledges of reshoring, and headlines about production moving south of the Canadian border create the impression that the strategy is working. From a distance, it looks like leverage is being applied and concessions are being forced. But when the data are examined closely, the list of actual winners becomes much smaller. Large multinational automakers can absorb higher costs temporarily. They have access to capital, diversified production footprints, and the ability to shift expenses across regions. Smaller suppliers do not. Many American parts manufacturers operate with narrow margins and depend on predictable cross-border flows. For them, tariffs function less like protection and more like a tax they cannot avoid. Employment figures illustrate this imbalance. While a handful of assembly plants may announce expansions, supplier layoffs tend to be quieter and more dispersed. Thousands of jobs can disappear without a single headline. Economists tracking industrial employment patterns note that job losses in supply chains often outpace gains in final assembly during periods of trade disruption. The net effect is erosion, not growth. Consumers also fall firmly into the losing column. Higher vehicle prices reduce purchasing power and delay replacement cycles. Older vehicles stay on the road longer, increasing maintenance costs and safety risks. This effect is especially pronounced among middle-income households and retirees, groups that rely heavily on personal transportation and are less able to absorb price shocks. In this environment, the idea of national gain becomes increasingly abstract. Political victories do not translate into measurable improvements in household balance sheets. And as costs accumulate quietly, public tolerance begins to thin. That tension sets the stage for the next phase of the conflict, where economic pain no longer feels distant or theoretical. Looking further ahead, the long-term risks for the United States are far more serious than short-term price increases or quarterly earnings warnings. The core danger lies in the gradual weakening of the very ecosystem that has made North American manufacturing competitive for decades. Automaking is not just about assembling vehicles. It is about engineering, tooling, logistics, workforce training, and continuous innovation. These elements thrive in dense, integrated networks. When those networks are fractured by tariffs and uncertainty, efficiency declines and innovation slows. Over time, this makes domestic producers less capable of competing globally, even if they are physically located inside the United States. There is also a strategic labor dimension. Rebuilding supply chains entirely within national borders requires skilled workers at every level, from advanced manufacturing technicians to specialized engineers. The United States already faces shortages in many of these roles. Training pipelines take years to develop. Without sufficient labor, new facilities cannot operate at full capacity regardless of political intent. Canada, meanwhile, is adapting. Faced with prolonged uncertainty, Canadian policymakers and businesses are accelerating diversification strategies. Energy exports, critical minerals, and advanced manufacturing inputs are increasingly directed toward non-United States markets. Once these commercial relationships solidify, they are difficult to reverse. This means the leverage Washington seeks today may shrink tomorrow. Perhaps the most dangerous miscalculation is the assumption that time favors the United States. In reality, time compounds damage. Each delayed investment decision, each supplier closure, each lost export contract weakens the shared industrial base. By the time political conditions change, the underlying economic structure may already be altered beyond easy repair. And this leads to a deeply unsettling possibility. What if the greatest risk is not that the strategy fails quickly, but that it appears to succeed long enough to permanently undermine North American competitiveness before anyone admits the cost? That question becomes unavoidable when one specific long-term investment trend is examined closely, and it reframes everything discussed so far. At the core of the current approach is an unspoken assumption inside Washington that time favors the United States. The belief is that prolonged tariffs will slowly force companies to adapt, shift capital, and rebuild supply chains inside national borders. Under this logic, short-term pain is acceptable if it delivers long-term industrial independence. But this assumption collapses when confronted with investment data. Automotive manufacturing is among the most capital-intensive industries in the world. Once investment decisions are made, they tend to lock in production patterns for decades. According to long-range industry forecasts, a modern automotive plant is typically designed to operate for 30 to 40 years. Suppliers align around these anchor facilities, forming dense regional clusters. Here is the problem. Over the past several years, a growing share of global automotive investment has already been allocated elsewhere. Capital is flowing toward regions with stable trade frameworks, predictable regulation, and integrated access to raw materials. When tariffs introduce uncertainty, investors do not wait for clarity. They move, and when they move, they rarely come back quickly. This means the trade war clock is not neutral. Every month of uncertainty increases the likelihood that future production capacity will be built outside North America entirely. That outcome does not strengthen the United States. It shrinks its influence over the next generation of manufacturing. The most disruptive twist is hidden in forward-looking demand projections. Industry analysts now estimate that the global automotive market is approaching a structural plateau. Vehicle sales growth is slowing, not accelerating. Demographics, urbanization, and changing mobility patterns suggest that future demand increases will be modest compared to the past. In a slow growth environment, capacity decisions become zero-sum. Every new plant built in one region comes at the expense of another. If investment shifts away from North America during this tariff-driven uncertainty, there may be no second wave of expansion to bring it back. The window closes. This reality exposes a fundamental risk in the strategy to make automaking exclusive. The United States is not competing only with Canada. It is competing with every other manufacturing region for a limited pool of future investment. Tariffs do not exist in isolation. They signal risk. And in capital markets, risk is punished. There is also a political timing mismatch. Economic restructuring unfolds over decades, but political cycles move far faster. By the time the full consequences of today's trade decisions become visible in employment, productivity, and competitiveness data, the architects of the policy may no longer be in office. The cost, however, will remain. This is why the most serious danger is not immediate recession or price spikes. It is the slow erosion of North America's position in a global industry that is already facing transformation pressures from technology, energy transitions, and shifting consumer behavior. And that brings the analysis to its final, uncomfortable question. If the goal was to make the United States stronger by acting alone, what happens if the data ultimately show that isolation accelerated decline rather than prevented it? That answer, and its implications for American workers and consumers, cannot be ignored. What this trade war has revealed is not a simple clash between two neighbors, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern industrial power actually works. The push to make United States automaking exclusive may sound decisive, even patriotic, but the data tell a far more troubling story. Supply chains built over generations cannot be forced apart without cost. Tariffs do not operate in isolation. They ripple outward, raising prices, freezing investment, and quietly weakening the economic foundations they are meant to protect. For Canada, the damage is visible and immediate. For the United States, it is slower, more subtle, and potentially more dangerous. Higher vehicle prices, delayed capital spending, and shrinking global influence do not arrive all at once. They accumulate quarter by quarter, decision by decision, until the consequences are no longer reversible. The uncomfortable truth is that no country wins a prolonged trade war of this kind. The real question is not who concedes first, but how much long-term competitiveness is lost before policymakers recognize the cost. As North America stands at this crossroads, the choices made now will shape industrial strength for decades, not election cycles. So the question remains, and it is one that every American should consider carefully: is this a bold strategy to rebuild the United States economy, or a risky mistake whose true cost will only be understood when it is too late?